The night Seraphine walked out of the great hall, she did not look back. She could hear the feast continuing behind her. She could hear glasses touching, and low voices, and the scrape of chairs on stone. She could hear 300 people deciding, in the space of a single breath, that they had never really known her at all. The crown was gone from her head. She had not removed it herself. One of the king's guards had done it, quietly, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been given instructions in advance. That detail, the fact that someone had been briefed, that this had been planned, that a man had been given time to practice the motion of removing her crown so that it would not look clumsy in front of the court. That detail stayed with her longer than anything else. Kale had not looked at her once. She pushed through the main doors and the cold hit her immediately. Late autumn, the kind of cold that gets into the joints first. She was wearing a gown built for a throne room, thin fabric, no sleeves, sewn to impress rather than protect, and she stood on the top step of the palace and let the cold come. She pressed one hand, very gently, to the front of the gown. 3 months along. No one outside this palace knew. She had been planning to tell Kale that evening, before the feast, but the evening had gone differently than she expected. She picked a direction and walked. The border town of Heron's Cross was 4 days on foot, through woodland that had no name on any official map. Seraphine arrived on the 3rd day, because she did not sleep much, and because anger, she discovered, is a very efficient fuel. The town had a healer, an old woman named Bess who had once worked for a northern military camp and had seen enough of the world to have stopped being surprised by any of it. She asked Seraphine 2 questions. The first was whether she was being followed. The second was whether she wanted to be found. Seraphine said no to both. Bess nodded and put a kettle on. The twins were born on a night in late winter when the temperature dropped so severely that the windows of Bess's cottage went white with frost. Seraphine named the girl Zara because the name meant radiance, and she wanted her daughter to have something beautiful given to her at the start, before the world had a chance to take it. She named the boy Riven because he had arrived into the world fighting, tearing through every obstacle between himself and existing, and she thought the name should acknowledge that. She lay in the narrow bed in Bess's back room and held one of them in each arm, and she made herself a single promise. She was not going to teach them bitterness. Bitterness was a thing she could not afford. It sat in the chest like a stone, and got heavier every year, and eventually, it was the only thing you could feel, and she had 2 children to raise, and no time for stones. She was going to teach them everything else. Zara learned to read at 4. By 7 she was reading law, the old border trade agreements that Bess kept in a wooden box under her bed, thick with dust and dry language, and Zara would spread them on the kitchen table and ask questions so precise and persistent that Bess eventually started answering them honestly, which was not something Bess did with many people. Riven was quieter. He learned things by watching them first, for a long time, until he understood them completely. Then he was very good at them. He watched a traveling blacksmith work for 3 days before asking to try the hammer himself. The blacksmith, who had been at his craft for 20 years, later told Bess that the boy had a natural instinct for it, that he had only seen twice before in his life, and both times it had been in people who had been training since childhood. Seraphine watched her children grow and thought about Ironmere. She did not dwell on Kale. She had spent the first year doing that, turning the memory of that night over and over in her mind like a stone she could not put down, and at the end of the first year, she had made herself stop. Not because it did not hurt, because it did not help. She thought instead about the man who had stood 2 seats to Kale's right at the feast, Marin. His title was Royal Counselor. His actual role, she had understood only in retrospect, was to manage the information that reached the king, to curate it, shape it, present it in ways that produced the decisions Marin had already decided should be made. He had been doing it for years before Seraphine arrived. He had seen her immediately as a problem. She had just not seen him in return until it was too late. She did not make that mistake again. She spent the years building a quiet network of contacts across the border territories. Former soldiers who had left the Ironmere military and were willing to trade information for modest compensation. Merchants who crossed the border regularly and noticed things. A former court archivist who had retired to a small house near the river, and who still had copies of documents he was not technically supposed to have kept. She assembled what she knew slowly, carefully, the way you build a wall, one piece at a time, each one resting on the one before. And she taught her children. On the morning Zara and Riven crossed the border into Ironmere, they were 17 years old, and they traveled without title, without announcement, and without any marking that identified them as belonging to a pack. What they had was their mother's face on Zara, that particular stillness that had once made the court uncomfortable, because it made them feel observed, and their father's eyes on both of them, wolf gold. The kind of eyes that people in Ironmere remembered, because the Alpha King was not a man anyone who had met him tended to forget. It took 4 days for the court to start paying attention. Zara made no dramatic entrance. She approached the regional trade authority in the outer city and submitted a formal request to address a border treaty dispute that had been unresolved for 3 years and was quietly costing 6 villages their primary income. She had the relevant documents. She had case studies from comparable disputes in neighboring territories. She had a proposed resolution that was fair to every party involved. The regional administrator, who had been trying to resolve this specific dispute for 3 years and getting nowhere, looked at the documents she placed on his desk and then looked at her for a long moment. He scheduled the hearing. Riven, in the meantime, spent his days in the outer city's sparring grounds. He did not challenge anyone. He simply trained, alone, methodically, with the kind of concentrated focus that drew attention without asking for it. Men came to watch. They said very little, because there was very little to say. He was simply what he was, and what he was made itself understood without any words at all. By the end of the second week, the court knew there were 2 young wolves in the outer city who had no declared pack, no titles, and faces that looked like they had been assembled from a combination of the Luna, who had been banished 17 years ago, and the Alpha King who had banished her. Marin sent 2 men to find out more. Both men came back with the same report and the same expression, which was the expression of people who had gone to gather information and had instead been made to feel that they were the ones being observed. Kale was in the war room when Marin brought him the report. He was standing over a map of the outer territories, tracking the 3rd border dispute of the year, and he listened to Marin's summary with the same focused attention he brought to all tactical information. Then Marin mentioned the eyes. Kale did not move for a moment. He stood with one hand flat on the map, and the room was very quiet. He told Marin to arrange a formal meeting. Marin told him he did not think that was advisable. He framed it as a security concern. He had a list of reasons. He presented them in the careful, structured way he had been presenting information to Kale for 23 years, always leading with logic, always saving the emotional argument for last, always knowing exactly which angle would land. Kale looked at him for a long moment and then said to arrange the meeting. Marin arranged the meeting. Zara sat across from her father in a private council room and looked at him the way her mother had taught her to look at people she needed to understand, without hostility, without warmth, with the kind of clear and patient attention that sees the thing as it actually is, rather than the thing you want it to be. Kale, for his part, could not decide where to put his eyes. He kept arriving at her face and finding his wife there, 17 years younger, looking back at him, without any of the love that had once been in those features. He asked her directly. He said, "Are you Seraphine's daughter?" Zara said, "I am Seraphine's daughter and your daughter, and those are 2 different inheritances, and I have made use of both of them." He asked where her mother was. Zara said her mother was well. She said her mother sent no message. She said she and her brother were here on their own business, and it had nothing to do with his feelings about the past. Kale was quiet for a long time. He said, "What is your business?" Zara placed a folder on the table between them. Inside was the original evidence that had been used to condemn her mother, and beneath it, in clean order, was the documentation of how that evidence had been produced, who had authored it, who had carried it, who had been paid to confirm it, and the careful, almost elegant chain of decisions that led back, inevitably, to the man who had been standing 2 seats to Kale's right at the feast 17 years ago. She had not assembled this folder quickly. It represented 9 years of careful, patient collection. Every document was sourced. Every source was verified. There was nothing in it that could be challenged, because she had spent years making sure of that, before she walked through the border. Kale looked at the folder for a very long time. He did not say anything. Zara let the silence sit, because her mother had taught her that silence was not empty. It was the space where the other person finally has to face the thing they have been avoiding. 3 days later, Zara presented the folder in open court. She stood in the great hall, the same hall where her mother's crown had been removed by a man practicing the motion in advance, and she addressed 200 people in the clear, level voice that she had inherited from a woman who had once stood in a cold border woodland at midnight and decided not to fall apart. She did not accuse anyone dramatically. She simply presented information. She explained what each document showed. She explained how each one connected to the next. She explained what the complete picture looked like when you assembled all the pieces together. The hall was absolutely silent. Marin was present. He stood near the back. When Zara finished and the room turned toward him with the collective weight of 200 people arriving at the same conclusion simultaneously, he opened his mouth. Riven looked at him. He did not say anything. He did not move. He simply looked at Marin with his father's gold eyes and his mother's particular quality of seeing the thing as it actually is, and Marin closed his mouth. The silence after that was different from the silence during the presentation. That one had been shock. This one was conclusion. Marin was removed from his position by nightfall. The formal process took 3 weeks, but the outcome was decided in that hall, in that moment, in the space between the end of Zara's presentation and whatever Marin had been about to say before Riven looked at him. Zara submitted her legislation to the council the following morning. It took 12 pages to say what it needed to say, that no Luna, no Alpha, no member of any pack could be stripped of their title and exiled on the basis of evidence that had not been reviewed by an independent body, that the council could advise but could not execute, that the power currently concentrated in a single councilor's hands needed to be distributed across a body of 7, elected by pack representatives from across the territories. The council debated it for 2 weeks. They passed it. Zara did not celebrate this. She made a note of it and moved on to the next item. Seraphine walked through the gates of Ironmere on a morning in early spring. She came alone. She had dressed practically. Dark clothing, her hair pulled back, the kind of practical boots that you wore when you expected to be on your feet for a long time. She looked like someone who had made very deliberate decisions about who she was going to be, and had been living inside those decisions long enough that they had become simply who she was. Kale was at the bottom of the palace steps. He had clearly been told she was coming, and had prepared something to say. He stood with the posture of a man carrying a speech. Seraphine walked past him. She went into the great hall, to the exact spot where he had stood the night he read the decree, and she turned to face the assembled court. She spoke for 4 minutes. She thanked the council for the formal exoneration. She acknowledged the people in the outer territories who had helped her over the years. She said that she believed the territory was capable of being something better than it had been, and that she expected to see evidence of that in the years ahead. She did not mention Kale once. When she finished, Zara was standing at the side of the hall, watching with the still, patient attention she had learned from a woman raising 2 children alone in a border town on nothing but capability and a very clear idea of what she wanted to build. Zara looked at her mother, and her mother looked back, and nothing needed to be said between them, because everything that needed saying was already said. In the documents, in the legislation's 12 clean pages that would protect every woman who came after them from the same particular darkness. Later, Kale found Seraphine in the small garden behind the east wing. He sat across from her. He did not give his speech. He had clearly decided, somewhere between the steps and the garden, that the speech was the wrong tool for this moment. He said, "I know what I did." She looked at him. She said, "I know you do." The garden was quiet. A bird moved through the branches of the tree overhead. Spring was coming in slow, and the light had the quality of something new that had not yet decided what it was going to become. What happened between them after that, the court would wonder about for years. What was certain was that she did not leave. What that meant was hers to decide.